All right, so I'm going to, oh no, I don't know why I did that. All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so here we go. We have officially made it to the point where we've reviewed classification and we're starting to talk about the very first big group of animals in our exploration of the animal kingdom. And to be totally honest, these don't really look like animals at all. Now, if you get a chance when you're in the building the next time, whenever that might be, okay, if you stop at the glass case in the corner of this hallway, right by the chemistry lab, there are actually a collection of sponges in those cases. And it kind of gives you an idea of what they look like. So sponges actually do look like sponges, okay? So if you think about that for a moment, a sponge might be something like this and this. So if you can see the screen, if you can look at my camera for a moment, this is the remains of an actual sponge that was once living in the ocean. This is a synthetic sponge, okay? Very similar to things you might find in anyone's kitchen, okay? What I want you to do, if you think about these two things, this sponge and this sponge, okay? Do they have any similarities? Okay? Do they have any similarities? I mean, clearly they have differences, but do they have any similarities? Take like 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, to be totally honest, I wasn't really timing this time, right? But that seemed like enough time. So just looking at these two things, right? Uh, any similarities that stand out? Okay, they both have pores. And when you say pore, we're talking about Pore, like pores in your skin. What do we mean by that? What is a pore? Okay. Okay. So you were talking kind of about like human skin pores. Okay. Well, Logan, you were saying something. What were you saying? A hole. So would you agree that it's a hole? Okay. So a hole. Um, what kind of qualities does a sponge have? Like, what do you use it to do? To rub things. Okay. What? How does a sponge? So, anyone on Zoom want to chime in here? Anything that you want to add? So they have pores, which are like holes. We think. Anything else? Well, I agree with all of that. And this is why are sponges like our common name. It's not a very scientific name. Okay. Sponges are what we call the phylum Porifera. Porifera. Now you're going to write that down in a moment in your notes, so you don't have to write it down yet. Okay. And in fact, they are what we consider to be the simplest animals on the planet. So they actually do look very like plant-like, but they actually are simple multicellular animals. Simple multicellular animals. Okay. So again, cellular means made of many
Mrs.
cells.
Laurenti,
Yes.
Jessica says she needs to be letting us Zoom.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, when I'm in presenting mode, I can't always see that. Sorry. So, um, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. So we're good with this. So a sponge is a bottom dwelling creature which attaches itself to something solid in a place where it can hopefully receive enough food to grow. Now, bottom dwelling makes you think of really deep, but not necessarily. Okay. Uh, Sponges thrive in shallow coastal waters. So places where you might see things like coral reefs, where sunlight is still reaching that layer. Okay. Uh, that is where you would look for sponges. Okay. Now, bottom dwelling means that they have to connect to something. You're not going to see sponges moving around in their adult phase. Okay. They don't move. They're what we call sessile, Sessile, sessile. Okay. They do not move, at least not from place to place. So they belong to what we call the phylum Porifera, which literally means pore bearing or having pores. And these are really important to the ways in which sponges have evolved to survive. We think they may have been around for, well, some scientists will say a billion years, but certainly at least 5 to 700 million years um, on this planet. Okay. And they're still here today. Now, that being said, it's sometimes hard to distinguish a coral from a sponge. I, I struggle with that a lot. Um, and part of the reason why it's so difficult is that sponges come in a wide variety of shapes and colors. Okay. So you can see here, there's just an incredible assortment of types of sponges. There can be barrel sponges like this, like these kind of barrels, or even like glass sponges that are almost translucent. Okay. So, okay. Okay. So, sponges, although they don't have organs or a skeleton, okay, what they do have are materials called spicules. These spicules almost remind me of like throwing stars. Like they almost look like pointed daggers on three ends. Okay. And they're very hard. Okay. So some sponges have a very hard outer surface, and it's created by molecules like this. These are not living, spicules are not alive. They're created by living cells. If that makes sense. Okay. In addition, the soft part, so you've got the support structure in a sponge is the harder portion of it is called spicules, and the soft portion is called spongin, like a sponge, like softer, more flexible. Okay? So then, oops, sorry guys. So a sponge is covered with these tiny pores, which are called ostia. And we said that pores are openings or holes, but they lead to tunnels. Okay. So those tunnels go all the way through the body of the sponge. Okay. And they eventually lead into one large central tube called an osculum. Now, this one you can kind of see. If you look through here, you see these bigger openings. Those would be the oscula. So you've got all these tiny pores on the side that lead into these larger openings. Okay? Does that make sense? Kind of. And here I'm going to hold this up to the screen now. So you've got tiny pores all around the outside. And then in the central body of the sponge, you've got these larger holes called oscula. And so now we're finally getting into like how these things actually function. So what do they do? Like they're sitting there. How do they grow? How do they do anything? Well, a sponge is a filter feeder. And although it may look like it's a passive animal, it's actually very active in feeding. So the sponge actually creates its own current in the water. And water is not sucked in through the top. Water is pulled in through the sides. The water's filtered through all these channels, and then water exits the sponge through the osculum. Okay, once it's already gone through all of the tunnels. Okay, now we're going to get more into detail with this in a moment. So, what creates this current? Because that thing just looks like a barrel. Well, a sponge, all of the internal tunnels are covered in what we call collar cells. And they're called that because they literally do have like a little collar around them, like a little ringed collar around these cells. So here you've got the cell body, which is where the nucleus is. You've got the collar, and then you've got this little whip that comes out of the top called the flagellum. Okay? Now, what happens is that flagellum beats back and forth in a coordinated way and pulls water into the sponge. As the water flows over these cells, any food particles in the water can be sucked up into the cell and digested. Okay? Now, sponges have no organs, no tissues. They are literally just different types of cells working together. So you've got collar cells, and then you have other cells that deliver nutrients from cell to cell or things like that. But there are no organ systems. So there's no stomach, there's no brain, there's no heart, nothing, right? You're looking at a simple animal that exists on the cellular level, just coordinated cells working together, okay? It's really incredible. Now, this gives you an idea of flow through the sponge. So you've got the wall or the body of the sponge here, made of spongin and then spicules. You've got collar cells lining every surface, okay? And then there would be other cells in here that would be able to get nutrients from these collar cells, okay? And then perform other life functions like reproduction, like creating sex cells, okay? So the water pulls in here, and then in theory, this would be the osculum. And then the water is pulled in, filtered, and then goes out through the top. Oops, sorry about that. Now, these collar cells have another name that I would want you to add in here, and I'll type this in the chat. They're called choanocytes. So choanocytes and collar cells are synonyms. They mean the same thing, okay, for our purposes. So I'm trying to type this into chat. Not really working. Let me end the show. So I would add this on that page just so you have this in your records, okay? SpongeBob SquarePants, yeah, exactly. All right, so these are called choanocytes, okay? Those are the names of the cells. Okay. So the flagellum then is what beats back and forth. It creates the current through the cell or through the sponge. Okay, and then you've got the cell body here. So how big are the things that these guys are eating? Yeah,
Microscopic.
microscopic, yes. So they're eating things like plankton, bacteria, small single cell living things, not very big at all. Okay, so they need to be in very nutrient rich water to be able to survive. Okay, so another just repeat on that. Any questions so far? Okay, so the collar cells, not only are they pulling water through the sponge, okay, they're also collecting the nutrients. Okay, Now, because there are no organs, like no lungs or anything like that, all exchange is happening through these cells. So that means oxygen is also taken in through these collar cells. Carbon dioxide is gotten rid of through these cells. There's no like stomach and intestine. Everything is happening at the cellular level. Okay. Now, why do we start here? Because this is as simple as it gets for an animal. As we work our way up to the sharks, by the time we end this semester, we'll see 9 to 11 organ systems in a single organism. Okay. But this is where we believe it started with animals like this. Okay. Now, so here's a little repeat. So I don't really need to say anything else on this slide. I think we got that covered. Any questions here? No? Okay. Okay. They bring in food. So I got a little ahead of myself with my explanation. So this is really nothing new here on these slides. So really, they can't eat anything that isn't microscopic. Okay, really is what it boils down to. I don't know if there's sponges that are big enough to eat anything larger than that. I don't believe so. But I would want to look that up to be sure, but I don't believe so. Okay. Any questions on this slide? Okay. So they're actually very effective at doing this, at filter feeding. I forget how many gallons they can pump in an hour, but it's incredible. Right? So they are literally creating their own current, finding their food in the water. Okay. And it's very, very interesting. Now, the next clip or the next slide is a clip. We're not going to watch that yet because we're just going to watch one at the end. Okay. So the last thing I want you to think about is reproduction. Now, in the simplest animals, we can see either sexual or asexual reproduction. Now, when you see these two words, it's very important that you know what they mean because this is going to come up with every phyla we talk about. So, for sponges, let's say a piece of the sponge breaks off and it lands in a new place. That piece that's broken off can start to grow there. We call that budding, and that's asexual. That means there was no exchange of genetic information. It's just one individual, basically like a clone. Okay? However, some sponges also reproduce sexually. So what they would do is release sperm into the water. The female egg cells are always protected. They're usually not just released into the water. Okay? Then a female sponge would filter that sperm out of the water and then become fertilized. Does that make sense? Then, after fertilization happens, the female sponge would release the embryos into the water, and hopefully they would land in a place where they could grow and thrive. Now, the only way you would know this for sure um, is probably by investigating the sponge microscopically, which of course would mean killing it. So it's not really necessary to do this um, in most cases. Okay. Any questions on this reproduction piece? Okay, I would just stress if it is asexual reproduction, that means there's just one individual. There's no exchange of genetic information. For sexual reproduction, even if the two organisms don't touch, that doesn't mean it's not sexual. Sexual reproduction just refers to the fact that there's been an exchange of genetic information. Two individuals have combined genes to produce the next generation of organisms. Okay? that is sexual reproduction. Okay. Now, so this is a barrel sponge, and all of that like cloudy material coming out of the top of the sponge is sperm. Okay, so it releases its sperm into the water, hoping that it will reach a female sponge. And here are some more examples of that. Okay, now last slide. So asexual reproduction would be budding, and that's just when like a tube breaks off. I will in a second, and then allows and hopefully lands in a good place and then is able to grow and reproduce. Okay. Now, at the last portion of your slide is a drawing, a sketch. So the last thing we're going to do today is I'm going to show you a quick informational video about sponges. It's a little corny, okay, so I apologize for that in advance, but it has some really good information in it, okay? So now we're going to switch screens and watch that now. Um, if you get disconnected, or if you're not able to hear this, this is called Jonathan Bird's Blue World and Sponges. Okay. Now I'm going to show you how we figured out how sponges eat, and it's pretty crazy how we figured this out. Okay. So give me 1 second so I can switch this up. I'm going to take off my headset, and we will get started in a minute.